Hey guys, and happy Thursday. Today is May 7th, and this is for Math 2. Today we're going to talk about inverse functions, okay? So before we get started, let's just quickly define what they are. So an inverse function undoes the original function. So it's like undoing. So we got to think about what are the things that we do when we're trying to solve an equation. We're undoing them. So if it's multiplying by 2, to undo it, I divide by 2, that kind of thing. And this is the notation we use for inverse functions. Okay, I know it looks like a power of a -1, and this looks like timesing, but it's not. It's f of x, but then it's the inverse is shown with the -1. Okay, so that's the notation we're going to use. Now, there are two different ways to do inverse functions, and I'm going to show you both, and you can choose whatever way makes more sense to you. Okay, your choice. So let's look at our first example here. I have a function, and I want to find the inverse function, the function that undoes the original function. Okay, so I'm going to start with method 1. So method 1, I'm going to start by writing out what's happening to x here. Okay, so my first step, here's x. What's the first thing that's happening to x? Well, the closest thing to it is the 8, and the operation between them is timesing. So the first step is it's multiplying by 8. That's the first thing closest to the x. And then the next closest to the x is the 1, and it's being added. So I'm adding 1 next. And that's all that's happening there. So if I want to do the inverse, I'm literally going to do the opposite, but I'm going to go backwards, of course, because I'm undoing. So I'm going to start at the bottom this time. My first step starts at the bottom. If I was adding 1, how do I undo adding 1? Well, I subtract 1. And then continue to go backwards up to this one. If I was multiplying by 8, how do I undo multiplying by 8? Oh, I subtract 8. Why did I put subtract? I'm so sorry. Divide by 8. I was looking at the other word. Divide by 8. Okay? So then now I'm just going to literally do that. So imagine like having your x here, and you're going to go in this order. So x, subtract 1. So that's going to be x minus 1. And then after I subtract 1, I'm supposed to keep going this way. Then I'm going to divide by 8. Now, since the dividing by 8 is last, the whole thing has to divide by 8. So make sure you go in order, okay? And then I'm just going to put that inverse function notation in the front, like so. So there is my inverse function. Okay, I'll show you another way to do that. It's going to give you the same result. It's just a different method. It's the same, okay? So let's go ahead and look at another method here. So another method you could do to find the inverse function is, since it's inverting it, what you can do is you can start by switching the x and the y to invert it, okay? So I'm going to take this equation. I'm going to write it out with the y first. Remember, f of x is the same as y, right? I'll write it out with a y. Then I'm going to switch my x and my y. And then I'm going to go ahead and solve for y like I normally have it y equals, so I'm going to get y by itself here. Okay, so I'll start by what's farthest away from the y, which is the 1. To get rid of adding 1, I'm going to subtract 1 to both sides. 1 minus 1 is 0. Here I can't subtract 1, so I'm just going to write it as x minus 1 equals 8y. And then the number on the same side as the y is the 8, and it's multiplying. So the opposite of multiplying by 8 is dividing by 8, both sides. 8 divided by 8 here is 1. Bring down what I have left. Can't divide that, so I just leave it as a fraction. And then I can rewrite it using my inverse notation. So inverse function equals x minus 1 over 8. Notice it's exactly the same. And I even did the exact same thing. Look, did you notice? I subtracted 1 here. What did I do first here? Subtracted 1. Here I divided by 8. What did I do second here? Divided by 8. So literally the exact same thing. It's just one is using wording and one is using a more algebraic approach. So you're doing the same operations. It's just up to you what makes more sense to you. It's your choice, okay? Let's do one more just so you can kind of see that again, okay? So let's look at this equation right here, this function. And we're going to start by writing the steps of what's happening to x, okay? So the first thing that's happening to x, that means closest to the x. First thing that's happening to the x is it's timesing by -3. Right here, that's the closest. So multiply by -3. It's the first thing that's happening to x. Then the next closest thing is it's subtracting 2. And then after that, the whole thing is being divided by 5. Okay? So then to undo it, I'm just going to go backwards. I start from the bottom. First step is at the bottom. How do I undo dividing by 5? Well, I multiply by 5. Backwards again. How do I undo subtracting 2? Well, I add 2. Backwards again. Well, how do I undo multiplying by -3? Well, I divide by -3. I'm going to start with my x here and I'm going to go backwards. So it says first multiply by 5. So if I have x and I multiply by 5, then that's 5x, right? I'm going to move this over a little bit so I don't get too squished. Okay, then I'm supposed to add 2 to it, so plus 2. Then I'm supposed to divide everything by -3. -3. Then I can write inverse function equals that. Now, I will make one quick comment here. Most of the time, if there's a negative on the bottom, usually to simplify, we divide everything out by a negative. So imagine this is on the bottom is like -1 times 3. So I'm dividing everything out by the -1 just to make it more simple so I don't have a negative on the bottom. So 5 divided by -1 would give you -5x, and 2 divided by -1 would give you -2. And then -3 divided by -1 would just give you 3. So most of the time they don't like leaving a negative sign on the bottom. It's not necessarily wrong, it's just not proper. So there's my inverse function. Same thing using the other method we talked about. So I can start by writing it as a y equals -3x minus 2 over 5. Then I'm going to switch my x and my y. So x equals -3y minus 2 over 5. Then I'm going to solve for y. So to get rid of the y, start with what's farthest from the y first, which is the 5. It's being divided. The opposite of dividing by 5 is multiplying by 5 to both sides. Here, 5 divided by 5 is just 1. So I end up getting 5x equals -3y minus 2. And then I get rid of the -2 next because that's farthest away from the y on the side. So add 2 to both sides. 2 minus 2 is 0. Bring down the -3y. I can't add these because this has an x and this one doesn't, so I just write it as 5x plus 2. Then I get rid of the -3. It's multiplication, so the opposite is dividing by -3. -3 divided by -3 is 1. So y equals, can't do anything there, so just leave it as a fraction. Like so. And then like I talked about earlier, I can simplify that as well by dividing out the -1. So 5 divided by -1 gives me -5x. 2 divided by -1 gives me -2. -3 divided by -1 gives me +3. So my inverse function is right there. Again, notice it's exactly the same. And you're doing the same things. Look, what did I do first here? I times by 5. What did I do first here? Times by 5. Here I added 2 next. Here I added 2 next too. Here I divided by -3. Then I divided by -3. You're doing the same thing. It just depends on you if you prefer the algebraic approach or if you prefer doing inverse operations with words. Your choice. It's up to you. Okay. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I hope you guys have a great day. Contact me through Remind, email, or Google Classroom if you need anything.